Thank you very much indeed. It's lovely to be back at the office group. I was just chatting about a few years ago I spent some very happy days in the Paddington office. So you're well looked after here with the TOG team. And my talk is all around brand strategy, but I'm going to start by telling you a story that's related to that slide, which is a chalkboard of a coffee shop. And that coffee shop was in Nova Scotia, northeastern Canada. And I was chatting away to Jeff, who is the founder of pretty much a very successful chain of cafes. And they had coffee stocked in all the supermarkets in the region. And it seems as though I'd asked Jeff a difficult question. Because I said to Jeff, this name of yours, Just Us, what's it all about? It's an interesting name, but what's the story behind it? And he thought about it for a while and said, well, we're a fair trade coffee company, so we buy our coffee directly from small farmers, and so we want justice for the farmers. So Just Us and Justice, they sound kind of similar, so that's why we're called Just Us. To which I said, no. There's got to be a better reason for the name than that. So have another think. And as he's thinking, I can tell you his story. Him and his wife, Deborah, they were both social workers, and they decided one day they wanted to do something that they felt would have greater impact. So they decided to start a coffee company. Jeff flew down to Mexico and went to visit a cooperative there. And after a few days, he phoned up his wife and said, I think we should start a coffee company. So she got on the phone to the bank, remortgaged the house, and 6 weeks later, an enormous container of coffee arrived on their front lawn. And like true entrepreneurs, they said, well, what do we do next? And whatever they did worked, because, as I say, they now had 5 or 6 cafes, they had products stocked in all the supermarkets. And there I am, with Jeff in one of his coffee shops. And he says, yes, I remember now, yes, there's Just Us. We're a small company. We're fighting against consumer indifference to the plight of the coffee farmers. We're fighting against the big corporates. Yeah, that's the reason. There's only us. There's just us. To which I replied, no. There has to be a better reason. Now, Jeff is clearly a very successful man with a very successful business. So what's going on here? And it happens quite a lot with brands, with companies. You kind of start to carry things around with you, collateral, names, logos, ways of talking about your brand that really aren't relevant anymore. They're not right, but you still sort of carry them around with you and sort of make excuses for why you still talk about X when actually you're selling Y. So it's not an unusual thing. And I'm delighted to say that what Jeff then told me was so amazing, I wrote it down. And I'm going to read you what he said. This, by the way, is not for sale. This is my copy. He said, Bruce, we're all on a journey of life together, locally and globally, and we're all part of the same human family. And as we visit our partners throughout the world and share their struggles, successes, and dreams, this connection has continued to drive us. So the most powerful of all reasons for the name, and the most concrete, is the idea there is no them and us, just us. And it was this wonderful idea that there's one planet, we're all on it, and we have to look after each other. And that was the beginning of opening up the brand, the beginning of the story of Just Us. And that's often what a job of a brand is, to start to tell the story of your brand. And, what I was getting to was the point of their brand. And I like points because they stick into things. And every brand needs a point, a sharp definition of its focus that's going to stick in customers' minds. Okay? And that means making a choice, of course, about what that one point is. And that can be very hard. I know this because whenever I say to a client, give me a sentence that describes your business, tell me about the point of your brand, they'll say, well, it's not possible, Bruce. It depends on the audience we're addressing. It depends on the product that we're featuring. It depends on the campaign we're running, the territory that we're in. And all these things are important, but you should be able to rise above the minutiae to be able to define your point. And so back in 2009, I set up my business with the idea of helping clients to define their point, to give them a framework to make good choices about how to describe their brand. And 3 years ago, I put it into a book, not surprisingly called What's Your Point? Anyway, so today what I'm going to go through, if I can go to the next slide, please, is I'm going to first of all talk about what are the benefits of a brand strategy. Yeah? Why should you care about brand strategy? What's the value that it's going to deliver? So we're going to first look about what are the benefits of a business, of a brand strategy. Then we're going to look at, well, what is it? And then we're going to look at what some of the things that you can do with a brand strategy. And then once we've done that, before we get back to the bar, we'll have a Q&A. Does that sound okay? Brilliant. Okay. Fantastic. But before we go any further, I kind of need to kind of define what a brand is, because when I started thinking about writing a book, I thought, well, there must be books about brand and brand strategy already. And there are a lot of books about branding, a lot of books about global brands or brand management. There's not a single book about brand strategy. Okay, so I thought here's an opportunity to put that right. But it's very important that we share the same kind of language if we're going to be listening to each other and working together over the next 45 minutes. So it's important that we define the words we use. So what is a brand? It's a service or a product. So it can be a B2B service, a B2C product that delivers a consistent and distinctive benefit to a customer. Okay, so it's distinctive. You can recognize it. It's consistent, so you get the same every time. And it's relevant, i.e. it's solving a problem for the customer. So that's a brand. And a brand strategy is simply a way of being able to make good choices. So we can have the next slide. It's a framework for you to make good choices about how you're going to define and express your brand. Okay? So that's a brand and that's a brand strategy. So let's move on to talk about the key elements that go into let's talk about the benefits of a brand strategy. First of all, it's worth just clearing up the fact that brand strategy isn't for the marketing team. Okay? It's not for the sales team, it's not for the design department, it's for the whole organization, because it directs the whole organization. You know, it stands to reason if you have a shared understanding of your brand, if there's an alignment of your brand from your whole team, you're much more likely to be effective than if you don't have that alignment. Yeah. So if your HR team are hiring people who reflect your values and believe in your values, if your product team are creating products that deliver that benefit, if your marketing team are creating campaigns that amplify the benefits and amplify your values, you're going to be cohesive. In fact, you're going to start saving money because you're going to become much more efficient in terms of how you use your resources. So it boosts your resources. And it also allows you to basically say, well, where are we headed? Let's define a vision for this brand, a place we want to head to as a business. And the process allows you also to distill your true value. I sometimes talk about brand strategy as like treasure hunting. You know, you find an old treasure chest somewhere and you open the lid and you put your hand in and you pick out something, you blow the dust off, it's an old boot, get rid of it. Put your hand in again and you blow the dust off and there's a ruby. Wonderful. Well, you're going to keep ruby. And that's a lot of what brand strategy is about doing. It's about defining what's of value. Let's use those things that have value, and let's discarding things that don't have value. Let's discard them. The process also will allow you to define your key messaging. So your key messaging, you can't help but have key messaging. You know, if you have a brand, if you have a business, you will be using key messaging. You're using key messaging on your website, on your presentations, on your business cards, on your product. So it's absolutely critical that you make sure that your key messaging reflects your brand. And finally, it will deliver a difference. It will help you to be distinct in your market. So there's some very significant benefits for brand strategy. So it's worth sticking around for another half an hour. What I want to do now is to talk about the various elements that go into the brand strategy. And you can see here we've got the vision, the positioning, proposition, values, and audience. So I will whiz through these. Brand vision. I talked about this idea of defining where you want to head to. The very good thing about knowing where you're going is that you'll know when you get there. Of course, if you don't define where you're going, how do you know when you arrive? And it's the same with businesses. It's really important to be able to clarify just where are we headed, yeah? And because the job of a brand strategy is to help build the business towards meeting that vision and getting to that destination. And there are three key things about a vision. First of all, it needs to be big. Yeah? You want to think about a vision that's going to make you slightly nervous because it's an ambition. Yeah? It needs to be broad, so it has to be as relevant to your HR team as it is to your product team, or as it is to the marketing team, etc. So it needs to be relevant across your business. It needs to be understandable across your business. I always say a couple of sentences. That's all. Yeah, and then it needs to be long term. So it needs to be far enough away that you're not stuck in the weeds, but not so far away that you don't have to worry about it. So I say for tech companies, and I work with a lot of software firms, tech firms, 18 months for them is long term. And for sort of non-tech firms, 5 or 6 years. Now, what falls out of that process is absolutely key, because you will ask yourself then, well, what do we have to help us get there, our drivers, and what's going to slow us down, our barriers. Yeah. So it's a fantastic way of auditing your capacity as a business to be able to move towards your vision, move towards your destination. So drivers could be things like a round of funding you've just received, a fantastic innovative product that you're about to launch, an amazing leadership team, for example. Barriers are things that you either have to stop doing or start doing. So maybe you don't work well as a team, maybe you do work in silos, or perhaps you've taken your foot off the innovation pedal and a competitor's come along and has started to take your market share. These are super important things to be able to understand as a business, because your drivers, your assets, you can start to build on those and use those. And your barriers, you can start to address them. Yeah. So barriers and drivers. So you can see already that brand strategy has a role to play far beyond directing, for example, how the website looks. Not that that's not important. All right, so we move on to the next element, which is the brand positioning. There it is. And when I wrote the book, my publisher said, look, Bruce, you're going to have to think of another way of talking about positioning, because it's just, well, no one understands it, which is fair enough. And I really tried my best to find another way of talking about brand positioning, but I couldn't. So you'd have to bear with me. What I mean by brand positioning is this idea of what's at the heart of your business. What's its DNA? Yeah. If you kind of cut open your business, you're opened up any element of your business, what would you find? What was the consistency? What's the consistent thread that runs through your business? And just like a DNA, you don't see it. We don't see our DNA, but we see the effects of our DNA. It's the same with a brand positioning. So it kind of acts almost like a rudder for your business. So you can't see the rudder, but you can see where the boat goes. Yeah, and the boat goes where the rudder takes it. So the idea is to enable you as a business to have a very clear idea about making sure you're headed in the right direction. So brand positioning. And when we work on a brand strategy with clients, we do the brand positioning at the very end. Because what you want to do is you want to step back and look at your business and say, you know what? Looking at every element of our business, what do we see? What's the hallmark of our business? And I always try and get to a single word with our brand, with a brand positioning. Next chart, please. because I'm a big fan of less is more. Now, I talked about brand strategy being this idea of making good choices. As a brand owner, if you don't make choices, other people will. And those other people, be they web designers, be they customers, be they suppliers, aren't qualified. Yeah? You know your brand better than anyone. So the idea of a brand positioning is to make those choices, to distill all those words into something that is very, very potent and powerful. Just like when you're boiling a sauce or making a sauce, a jus, the more you distill, the more you boil it, the thicker it becomes and the more flavorful it becomes. It's the same with words. So that's the brand positioning. So if that's the brand positioning, and that's for you, that's for your team, how do we express that to our stakeholders? And we do that through the brand proposition. I don't know if anyone's ever heard the expression, don't judge a book by its cover. Well, that's garbage. Everybody judges books by covers. And so we've got to make sure that our cover, our introduction to our brand, is starting to tell the right story. Yeah. So a brand proposition, next slide please, is the start of the story. It's not the whole story, but it's the beginning. It's teeing you up to be able to talk eloquently about the benefits that your brand can deliver to customers. I sometimes think of it as a big open door to your business. The better the brand proposition, the easier it is for customers to walk into your brand. That's the purpose, that's the role of a brand positioning. And what often happens is we put boulders and barriers in front of that big open door. Yeah, we talk about this, but actually we do that, or the logo needs to be updated, or the website's not as good as it should be. All these are barriers to stopping people coming into your business, yeah. And what you don't want to do is start to talk to people about what you are not, because you have a very small window. Yeah, so you want to be talking to your customers about what you are, and a brand proposition is a very, very good way of doing it. Think of it sometimes as a slogan. Yeah, it does the job of a slogan, but very importantly, it's as meaningful to your team as it is to your customers. That's the difference between a slogan and a brand proposition. So, next slide, please. We come on to brand values. What is the character of your business or your brand? And every business has a character. You can't help but have values or a character, because if you put two people in a room together, there'll be a culture, there'll be values. So, what role do they play in business? What role do they play with brands? Well, they play two very important roles. The first is they act as a benchmark for your team. So, for example, let's say you're thinking about developing a new product, or you just have some recommendations from the web agency, or you're thinking about bringing somebody else onto the team. You can ask yourself, will this new person, will this new initiative, will this new site, does it reflect our values? Yeah. If it does, fantastic, we can move forward. If it doesn't, then clearly it's not right and we need to find an alternative. So it's a very, very useful way of benchmarking not only the way in which you describe your brand, but also how you behave in the brand, how you behave in the business. So very influential internally and very influential externally. Think of brand values as a hallmark for your customers to recognize you by. Now, we know that we get around 10,000 messages a day. We're bombarded with them from the moment we wake to the moment we go to sleep at night. And our brain does a fantastic job at getting rid of 99.999% of them. And it does that by allowing the brands that we like and we recognize into our consciousness. And if you are consistent in how you express your values and how you deliver your values to your customers, you're much more likely to be remembered, Your brain will retain that knowledge, and you'll be allowed in, if you like. So very influential. They're very boring when they're written down on a piece of paper, but they're very interesting when they're actually used. I remember I was working with a client in Germany, and I asked him, "Where are your values? And tell me about your values." He said, "You'll find our values in the kitchen," which I thought was a bit odd, but sure enough, written on a wall in the kitchen were the values. So we move on to audience, and I think this is probably one of the most significant differences between brand strategy and sales strategy or marketing strategy, and that is the number one audience for a brand strategy is the team. It's you, yeah, because it's your job to communicate the brand to your customers and your stakeholders. And if you don't get the brand, what hope do your customers have? So your number one audience is your team, yeah. And obviously, we need to understand the customers who are going to be, using our brand. And what we want to understand is, well, let's look at their characteristics. Is there a primary audience? Is there a secondary audience? Let's understand their profiles, etc. We're not going to go into deep dive personas. That's not the job of a brand strategy, but it's certainly the job of a brand strategy to say, these are the different audiences, these are their behaviors, and these are the challenges and the issues that we need to help them with. But more importantly than what makes them different is what brings them together. So we then do an exercise in looking at, okay, what are the characteristics that they all share? Because we only have one brand, and that brand has to be relevant across all your different customers. So there we have it. That's a whistle-stop tour of the elements that go into a brand strategy. And what I wanted to share with you now was just, well, what can you do with it? Yeah. So I'm going to give you some very brief examples. The first is this idea of helping you define your key messaging. I said earlier on that we all have key messaging. It's not an option. And so you've got to make sure that your key messaging reflects your brand. And I call it the tyranny of the first. There's always going to be a first message, isn't there? There's always going to be a first chart in your sales presentation. There's always going to be the first headline on your homepage. There's always going to be a need to put something on your business card in terms of your brand, your messaging. And so it's really, really important that you are clear about the order in which that messaging appears. Yeah. So when you're developing a brand strategy, it allows you to be able to put your messaging into a hierarchy. And again, that's your job as a brand owner, is to know what's the most important thing about this brand. What's the second most important thing, third, fourth, and fifth. Okay. And when you're developing key messaging, it's really important that we put the benefits before the features. Now, I work a lot with tech firms, and they love talking about how they do stuff. They love talking about messaging. About their processes, etc., and about their features, and all very important, but meaningless until you have the attention of a customer. And you get the attention of a customer by solving their problems, by talking about their benefits. So any key messaging should start with benefits and then move on to, well, this is how we deliver that benefit. And your messaging needs to be both relevant and different. Relevant, i.e., we're solving a problem, we're delivering a benefit to you, but it can't just be relevant. Because if it's just relevant, it could be the same as everybody else. So it needs to be relevant and different. If it's just different, well, you won't have any customers. So relevant and different. And what that will allow you to do is to be able to express your elevator pitch, which is old-fashioned language for what we now call the value proposition. And the story goes that it was called the elevator pitch because in the olden days, when we all worked in buildings, the CEO would travel down from the top floor to the bottom floor. And if you happened to find yourself in the same elevator as the boss, you had the length of time from the management suite to the ground floor to pitch your idea. And that's why it's called the elevator pitch. And your brand strategy will deliver you your elevator pitch or your value proposition. About 100 words that clearly and concisely define why someone should care about your brand, which, by the way, is very useful in social media, of course. Okay, so if it directs your messaging, it has a very influential role in understanding how to use your brand name. I don't know if anyone's heard of the brand Carl's Hill. Carl's Hill. It's a global beer brand, Carl's Hill. It was founded by a fellow called Jacob Jacobson back in a couple of hundred years ago. He was an industrialist. He was a lover of the arts, a successful business person, and he decided he was going to put all his skills together to brew the perfect beer. So he built a brewery on top of a hill, and casting out for a name, he decided to name it after his son, Carl. So, Carl's Hill. But of course, the hill was in Denmark, so it was Carlsberg, which you probably have heard of. And about 3 years ago, Carlsberg changed every single thing about their business. The formulation of the product, the distribution, the supply chain, the packaging. The only thing they didn't change was the name. So names are potent. But how do you put rigor into names? How do you put rigor into something that's so sort of subjective? I thought long and hard about this, and I came up with quite a sophisticated system. Your name is either good, bad, or ugly. And an ugly name, forgive me for being so rude about names, but it's a homage to an old spaghetti western. Good names are names that really help to usher your customers into your brand, yeah? They really align with how you want to describe the benefits of your business. Just like we did with that story I told you about Just Us, it's the beginning of a narrative about your brand. And if you have a good name, brilliant, make sure you use it properly. A bad name is a name that's actually damaging your business. It's actually telling people stuff that isn't true about your brand or taking customers in the wrong direction. And there's not that many bad names out there, and I always counsel clients, try not to change your name. Because, of course, it's everywhere, isn't it? It'll be on your URLs, your emails, the side of your vans, business cards, you name it. So it's quite a big deal. So quite often, names fall into the ugly category. What I mean by that is they're not damaging the business, but they're not really helping it either. And when you have a name like that, an ugly name, what you want to do is you want to help it. I'll give you an example. I work with a client called Aries. And you might think, gosh, Aries, what does Aries do? Well, I can promise you, you wouldn't be able to guess what it does. It's a pensions legislation compliance company. Okay? They help big pension funds steer their way through all the tax changes. Why were they called Aries? Because that was the name of their computer system 30 years ago. Okay? So it's not wrong, but it's not right either. And so what we did, we used the brand strategy and we put the word insight after Aries because that was their brand positioning. They deliver insight to their customers. So they were able to keep their dearly loved name of Aries, but we added insight, and so it started to help them talk about the benefits they delivered to customers. And then finally, logos. Very often, brand and logo are used interchangeably. And of course, brand strategy has a very significant role to play in how you develop a logo. And in fact, sort of the logo, they say, what do they say? A picture paints 1,000 words. Well, then you've got to make sure that those 1,000 words are the right words. Yeah. So your logo is a visual encapsulation of your brand strategy. And brand strategy will help you think about your logo in 3 important ways. So it needs to be distinctive. I don't know if you can see that painting, the Folie Bergère there. There's actually a brand of beer on that painting that is Bass. I know it's Bass because it's got a red triangle on it, and that red triangle has been on every bottle of Bass since the 17th century or something. Yeah, so it needs to be distinctive. You can see there are 2 mini logos. There's the original mini logo, which was done in the 50s, and then the mini logo that was developed by BMW when they bought the rights to the mini and made one that didn't break down. And the reason they chose that logo was to remind people of the old Mini, to say the Mini that you had so much fun in as a kid, it's still fun. Yeah. So it was this idea of taking the good things of the Mini brand and putting it into the new Mini brand. And finally, memorable. The story goes that in the Wild West, the cowboys would come home and go to the store and ask for those pants with the horses on them. So any logo that you develop needs to be distinctive, relevant, and memorable. And finally, you can't really talk about logos without talking about color. Color has a very important role to play. It's quite subliminal, but it's also very powerful. That's why red, for example, is the color used on buy buttons on websites or the stop sign on traffic lights. Blue is a calming color. It's a color that's used by lots of banks to calm people down. So a lot of corporates use blue. White is the color of purity. Orange, the color of creativity. Black, color of your designer's turtleneck. So color has a very important role to play. And strategically, when you're developing a brand, you need to ask yourself, do I identify with the color in our sector and be seen as part of that sector, or do I create a colorway that actually distinguishes myself from that sector? Color plays a very important, and the way you get to that is by drawing on your brand strategy. So there we are. We've talked about the idea of having a vision, a destination for your business. We've talked about defining a positioning. What's the heart of your business? What's its DNA? And how do you express that? Much like a slogan, we've talked about the role that values play, both internally and externally. And then we've looked at how brand strategy's main audience are the brand owners, are the team responsible for delivering the brand. And then we had to look at how you shape your key messaging using brand strategy. We've looked at naming, and then finally colorways. And so that's what I wanted to share with you about what is brand strategy. And you might think, well, gosh, that sounds like quite a lot of work, Bruce. How do you get to a brand strategy? Well, the reason I started my consulting practice back in 2009, and the reason why I wrote the book, is to make it as easy as possible for clients to make good decisions, to be able to navigate through these choices. And I'm just going to play you a short film that goes through the process that I use, which will deliver a brand strategy in a single day. In this brief video, I'm going to introduce the award-winning Brand Arrow framework and how it can deliver a brand strategy in a single day. Once done, it will deliver a crystal clear idea about what your brand stands for, what it needs to achieve, how relevant you are to customers, and why those customers should buy from you and not the competition. And you'll see the arrow is surrounded by text boxes that provide the space for you to answer a series of questions. Simply put, we look at a question, come up with a range of responses which we discuss, and then land on one or a combination that we feel is right. Okay, so let's have a look at the different elements that make up the brand arrow. At the back of the arrow, you'll find the flight, or the feathers, whose job it is to keep the arrow's direction straight and true. And this is where we house the brand vision. And its role is to keep the brand going in the right direction. Once the vision is defined, it allows us to ask, what do we have to help us get there? Our drivers. And what will slow us down? Our barriers. So now we move to where the brand arrow is pointed. Who is your brand aimed at? And we start by defining the most important audiences your brand needs to engage with. Whilst we need to understand what makes our audiences different, we really need to get to what characteristics do they all share? Because, of course, we only have one brand, and it needs to be relevant to all of them. Let's now move to the stem of the arrow, which contains the elements that will make up the brand's key messaging. First up, two simple questions. What's the customer problem, and how do we solve it? Once done, we move along the stem of the arrow and define the 5 key benefits of the brand and its 5 key features. The final element of the messaging content is to ask the question, what makes our brand different or distinct from others doing similar things? Based on everything above the stem of the arrow and the shared characteristics of our audiences, we have all we need to write our key messaging. And this leaves us with the final part of the brand arrow, the point. So now we can start to use the brand arrow to inform how to develop the brand strategy. Think of it as a pool of knowledge that you and your team have developed, and so now you can draw on that knowledge to make good decisions about your brand strategy. Let's start with your values, words that describe the character of your brand. Look across the brand arrow and see what words keep cropping up. This will give you a great sense of the values of your brand. And then ask yourself, is there a value that influences them all? And if so, that's going to help you define the brand positioning. What's at the heart of your brand? What makes it unique? Finally, you'll have all you need to write the proposition or slogan, a few words to simply introduce your brand. It's almost like an open door for your customers to walk in and engage with your brand. You'll also see we can now write the value proposition or elevator pitch based on the customer problem, how you solve it, and what makes you different. So, that's the tour. All this, by the way, is captured in my award-winning book, What's Your Point?, which can be purchased from Waterstones or Amazon. To find out more about the Brand Arrow, get brand strategy insights, book a Brand Arrow workshop, or find out when the next free taster workshop is, please scan the QR code or visit thebrandarrow.com. Thanks for your time, and I hope to see you soon. I'm seeing you now. So that's a whistle-stop tour of the process that we use to develop brand strategy. And what's great about that is it's a collaborative process. So the whole team gets to participate in developing the brand strategy. Because if you develop it yourself, if you own it yourself, you're much more likely to believe it and to commit to it. So, if I can ask you to click one more time, and another time. Pretty much that's it. That's the presentation. I've taken up about 40 minutes of your valuable drinking time, so thank you for your patience. But we've got 5 minutes, so if there's any questions, I'll be delighted to answer them.
Super. I was listening to an Elon Musk podcast the other day, and he was talking about some of the promises he'd made about Tesla and the business he had. Going back to your earlier reference on vision, and he had promised next year we'll be able to do this, and in 5 years' time we'll be able to do this, and fully autonomous cars, and that was the vision, certainly for Tesla. What's your advice to kind of brand ambassadors when a vision is not going to plan, and how often should you modify or change that?
Well, that's an excellent example, and it's very distressing to see that Tesla's in so much trouble. No, I would say brand vision is about every 5 years you look at your brand vision. If you are a conventional business, if you're an online business or a digital business, and I would put Tesla in that, you're talking 18 months would be the maximum length of time before you revisit it. But of course, it's not as if you put it in a box and then return 18 months later to look at it, because you're living it, you're using it to guide how you develop your decisions. So I think it would become for example, with the Tesla example, it would become very apparent very early on if that vision is not going to be realized. And then you adapt, of course. So thank you for that question.